Yo, what's going on, y'all? It's Cone, and we need to talk about the San Antonio Spurs. They were one of the more interesting teams in the entire NBA coming into the season, mainly because people had a very wide array of outcomes for them. Some thought they could push into the playoffs this season, others thought they would be a play-in team. There were some people who thought they would still be towards the bottom of the Western Conference, and there were a lot of reasons for why their range was so wide. The first one, of course, was Victor Wembanyama, because last season he was one of the best rookies ever, was top 2 in Defensive Player of the Year voting in his first season, just a game-breaking player who made massive strides towards the end of the season, especially on the offensive end. So it felt like coming into this year, if he carried that over and took the leap that he felt absolutely capable of, potentially being a top 10 player by the end of the season, the Spurs could really elevate in the standings. And this was aided by the addition of Chris Paul, a real veteran point guard who has elevated so many teams in the past. I say that as a Thunder fan, I know it firsthand from the experience. He's able to drag teams a lot further than they probably should go. They also added Harrison Barnes, just a good veteran to have over on that team, a squad that was very young last season that didn't have a lot of above average NBA level play, so Harrison Barnes was going to bring some of that to the table. They also had interesting young players like a Devin Vassell, a Keldon Johnson, for example. Trey Jones had a pretty good season last year. Jeremy Sochan, even though the point guard experiment wasn't the best, still a very intriguing prospect amongst some others. And they drafted Stephon Castle in the first round, giving another guard to Victor Wembanyama, and a guy that could get mentored by Chris Paul, as someone who many draft people that I talked to thought could be the best player to come out of this class, or at the very minimum, the best guard out of anybody. Plus, they're just coached by Greg Popovich, one of the best coaches of all time, so there are a lot of reasons to expect that the Spurs could be better than some people were anticipating, or at least take a big jump from last season, and so far, that leap is absolutely happening. Last night, they faced off against the Golden State Warriors, who have been jockeying with the OKC Thunder for the 1 seed all season, and they took them down 104-94, a dominant defensive performance from San Antonio, with Wemby dropping 25, 7, and 9, 22, 8, and 2 from Harrison Barnes, 9.7 dimes from Chris Paul, 19, 3, and 3, one of the best games of Stephon Castle's young career, a few points off the bench from Trey Jones, and Mamu, and Blake Wesley, and Malachi Branham. Devin Vassell didn't even play in this game, nor did Keldon Johnson, and they were still able to take down one of the best teams in the entire NBA so far this season. And this isn't even the first time in the last week that they've beaten one of the West's best teams. OKC, my favorite squad, took an L to them not too long ago, where Chris Paul turned into vintage CP3 in the fourth quarter, had 14 points and 11 dimes. No Wemby out there. Harrison Barnes had 20. You had 22 from Keldon Johnson, who could not miss from the outside. Charles Bassey was playing really well. You had 8 dimes and 10 points from Stephon Castle, who got a great block on Shea at the end of the game. The Spurs are really putting it together. They're looking very, very cohesive. They're a great defensive team. They're a top 10 squad on that end. And even though the offense has been below average, they're still putting together some pretty good wins and have themselves outside the play-in right now in the Western Conference because it's stacked. But they have a record of 9-8, when at this point last season, I believe they were like 4-13 through the first 17 games. And even though they're, outside the play-in right now, technically, they're tied with the Minnesota Timberwolves, only half a game back of the Suns at the 8th seed. They're only 1.5 games back of the 4-seeded Lakers. San Antonio's been one of the better squads, and they have been really decimated by injuries. Wemby didn't play a few games. Devin Vassell has hardly played this season. Trey Jones has dealt with some issues. Greg Popovich has not been at the helm for the past couple of weeks at this point, due to a health concern. It sounds like everything's okay with him, which is great to hear, but they've been really ravaged by a lot of outside forces, and yet, also, despite not playing like any Eastern Conference teams, because the East is bad right now, they've only played one. It's been nonstop gauntlet of the Western Conference. They're currently in the thick of this playoff race, and it's for a multitude of reasons. Of course, Wemby has been great. When he's been out there on the court, he's been putting together some monster stat lines, and it's really been stepping up as the season goes on. The beginning of the year, people are like, oh, Wemby is kind of disappointing right now. Like, why is he taking so many threes? That's been a constant narrative throughout the season with Wemby, and now he's drilling like nonstop 4+ threes a night. He's still taking a lot. Last night was 4 of 13 from the outside. We had a game against the Wizards where he was 8 of 16, 6 of 12 against the Kings, 6 of 9 against the Jazz. In that Wizards game, he had a 50 bomb. He had 34 in that game against the Kings, 28 against the Lakers. Like I said, 25, 7, and 9 last night against the Warriors. Of course, the defense is otherworldly. He's right up there at the top of the Defensive Player of the Year conversations right now, averaging 3.6 blocks per game, which it felt possible for Wemby to do that, but it still is crazy to read that number, about a steal and a half per game, complete game-changing defensive player, because you just can't go up against him. There's nothing you can do. And then the offense is really continuing to come along. The efficiency is getting better. He's currently shooting better from the field and three than he did all of last season. And again, he had a kind of a slow start to the year. So now that he's putting it together, he's back from injury. I think these numbers are only going to come up for Wemby. That's one of the scariest parts about the start the Spurs have had, is I think there is still another level or two for Wemby to get to just in this season alone. I also think Stephon Castle has more leaps than him this season. He's been really progressing as of late. Like I said, 19 against the Warriors, 18 against the Jazz, had 10 points and 8 assists against the Thunder, and didn't shoot that great. The efficiency has been the biggest struggle for Stephon Castle so far, but at the very minimum, every single night, he's going to give you unbelievable defense. He is competing at a ridiculous rate on that end right now against some of the best scorers in the league. Last night, Steph Curry had one of his worst games of the season against the Spurs. That's why they ultimately lost for the most part. And Stephon Castle was really making it difficult for him to get any air to get out there for shots. He was running with Steph, who's one of the craziest off-ball movers we've ever seen, sticking with him. As a rookie guard going up against one of the best players of all time, that is an extremely daunting matchup. And Stephon Castle really isn't scared of any of it. Had that great block against Shea at the end of the Thunder game. He has been given a lot of tough matchups, and I feel like he has continuously really stepped up in those moments. They're trusting him, and he's continuing to earn more of that trust. And if the efficiency comes around for Stephon Castle, whether it's this year or next year, whatever, that is a terrifying notion for the rest of the NBA. And it helps that, again, he's being mentored by Chris Paul, one of the best to ever do it, who's having a really solid season in his own right, averaging right under 11 points per game, 38.6% from three, 8.5 dimes, 1.3 steals. He's playing just 28.6 minutes per game. That's his second lowest mark of his entire career, outside of last year where he played with the Golden State Warriors. And he's just producing at a very high level. He's setting everybody up. He's orchestrating the offense. You get to those final minutes in the fourth quarter, and he's really cooking. Just completely torched the Thunder on some ridiculous shots at the end of our game against them. He's just the perfect type of veteran to elevate any team, to really manage those final few moments, to get the most out of young talents. He's doing it again like he's done in so many other stops before. Harrison Barnes is also deserving of a shout out. I feel like he got a little bit overshadowed by the Chris Paul acquisition, but he's playing some great basketball. 11.5 points per game, 44% from three, 52% from the field, and has 3 straight 20 pieces. Both those veteran acquisitions are paying massive dividends to the Spurs right now, both in terms of winning, and I feel like long-term impact having those guys to mentor the young players. And a lot of those young guys have also been showing out. Jeremy Sochan had a great start to the season before going down with injury. Hopefully he's able to get back at some point soon. Julian Champagnie has been thrust into a bigger role because of some of those injuries, and he's done a great job. The three-point shot is a little up and down when he's on. He's on, though. He's been playing great defense. If that shot becomes more consistent, that's a phenomenal 3-and-D wing to have on any team. I've liked a lot of the minutes that like Malachi Branham has given them. Keldon Johnson has had some really good moments, although it's been a little bit of a struggle in terms of the efficiency to begin the year. Yeah, a lot of guys have just been showing out for this Spurs team. They really especially locking on the defensive end offensively. As guys continue to find their shots, I feel like there's going to be some bounce backs in efficiency. And once Devin Vassell can actually like be in the lineup, he's currently out with a knee contusion, that's going to make a big difference. I think they need that extra score. Not to mention they've got a bunch of pieces if they wanted to in terms of young players and assets, draft capital wise, to make an acquisition if they feel like it around the deadline. If someone becomes available, they could be towards the top of the food chain in that regard. The Spurs have so many ways to maneuver this roster, and even if they don't make any drastic changes this season, this team is just way better than I was expecting to begin the year, and they're being really competitive out there in the Western Conference. And again, this is despite injuries, a relatively tough schedule to start the season, not having Greg Popovich for most of the year, although I do want to say Mitch Johnson, I think, has done a pretty good job in the interim. I wouldn't be surprised if this stretch and the way the Spurs are playing right now earns him some love for a potential head coaching job at some point soon, or maybe he just is the Spurs successor behind Greg Popovich. We'll have to wait and see, but I think he's done a pretty solid job, and there's still that massive runway for a jump from Victor Wembanyama, who feels like he's got at least one, if not multiple, in him for the rest of the season. As this team continues to build chemistry, you could see jumps from some of the other young guys. The Spurs are genuinely a pretty scary team to face on any given night right now. They're not ready, in my opinion, to make any noise in the playoffs at this point. I'm not even sure if they'll make it or not. I still feel like they end up right there in that play-in range, maybe outside as a lottery team, which is probably best for them long-term to add more young pieces next to Wemby. the scariest thought is that they somehow end up towards the bottom of the Western Conference anyways, and they jump in the lottery and get like a Cooper Flag. Please do not let that happen. I need star players to go over to the Eastern Conference because it's a mess over there right now. I may make a full video about how disastrous the East is at this point in the next few days. If you want to see that, let me know. But like, whether the Spurs make the playoffs, then it's like, oh, they're ahead of schedule, and that's scary, or they end up in the lottery and they grab one of the top picks, and that's terrifying. Everything about the Spurs and the way that they've set this thing up is scary. And of course, a lot of that is having Victor Wembanyama at the helm as probably a future top like 20-ish at the very minimum player of all time. But yeah, I want to show some love to the Spurs, the way that they've played so far this season. They are ahead of schedule. They have done a great job of rebuilding this thing. They're building something special, like I said in a video I dropped before the season, and we're seeing it come to fruition even quicker than I was expecting. So big props to the Spurs organization and all the guys that have been hooping over there. Let me know what you think about San Antonio right now. Do you think they could push into the playoffs? Do you feel like they're more of a play-in or a lottery team? Where do you think overall they end up in the standings? What are your expectations for them the rest of the season? And how do you feel about this core around Wemby? Do you think Stephon Castle will be that lead guard of the future? Do you feel like they'll grab someone in this year's draft that more so becomes like that number 2 next to Wemby? If there's any trade targets out there you think they should go for, who is that and why? Just a really interesting situation to be in. I love when teams get to this point where they've started the rebuild and they're trying to feel it out a little bit and we see how it evolves. That's always most interesting to me, rather than a team starting the rebuild and they're just, drafting top guys and losing a lot. This point where they start to turn it up and become more of a winning team, what decisions they make ultimately is the key to any good rebuild. And I feel like so far the Spurs are pushing the right buttons. For the moment, I appreciate you watching. Leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on future videos. And yeah, I'll see y'all later. Real one, say it back.